So it looks like the fruit, as I said, the fruit trees file is in the chat box, and the raspberries and strawberries file is just about finished uploading. So hopefully you guys can all see those and access those. And Michael says we can see it, so perfect. Time to go. So when I say fruit trees in Wyoming, I will say for most parts of Wyoming, apple trees are going to be a good place for most of you to start. And if you want to be more adventurous, depending on where you live, and you probably get away with growing some things that I can't get away with growing here in Laramie. And you would have better luck with some of the other fruit trees like pears, maybe even a peach tree, some cherry varieties, maybe even an apricot. But I'm gonna, and as Catherine mentioned, I do a little bit of research as part of my job, and one of the specialty crop research projects I've worked on is an apple variety study, and I'll share some, so most of the information I'm going to talk about tonight is on apples, just simply because I've worked mostly with apples, but I'll talk about some of the other fruit trees that you might want to try if you're feeling a little more adventurous. So let's talk about those, the types of trees you might want to grow for fruit in Wyoming. With apples, we're going to have the most varieties to choose from in terms of cold hardiness, especially. There's some zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5 apple trees, okay, that we can choose from. So zone 2, you can grow just about anywhere in Wyoming except for, you know, on top of a mountain. But pears, fewer options available to us who live at higher elevation. There's a few zone 4s, but many zone 5 varieties. So a lot of pears are on the borderline of their hardiness zone throughout much of Wyoming. So a lot of folks in Wyoming, pears probably are not going to be a good choice. Cherry varieties, kind of the same thing. There are some bush cherries and sour or pie cherry varieties that do have cold hardiness, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to grow some of the, you know, some of my favorite sweet cherry varieties like Bings and Rainier's. Peaches, there's really only one variety to try, and it's called Contender. It's the only zone 4 peach that I know of, and the rest are going to be zone 5 or 6, which means they're probably not going to live very long anywhere in Wyoming. And then plums, we actually have several, particularly the Native American plums, but also some Italian or European plums that can do well in parts of Wyoming. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview. Let's talk a little bit about variety selection. Really the thing that we're gonna need to focus on is cold hardiness. So, you know what your cold hardiness is. You guys down here in Laramie County around Cheyenne, you know, you are a little bit warmer than we are in Laramie. You're more of a, I guess, according to this, actually, that's interesting. It has Laramie listed as a 4B. Oh yeah, that's right. And you as a 5A. So that means that so these hardiness zones are based on average annual minimum cold temperatures. So on average, a zone 5A means that your coldest winter temperature is between -20 and -15 degrees. Well, and for Laramie, a zone 4B, according to this, it says that our average minimum temperature is between -20 and -25. Well, I can tell you that we've had close to -50 degrees in Laramie in the 9 years, almost 9 years I've lived here. So that is a huge difference. So if we select a zone 4 plant for Laramie, or for Cheyenne, a zone 5 plant, and we do get down to, -30, -40, -50 degrees on a really cold winter night, those zone 5 trees or zone 4 trees are going to struggle or die from, one really cold. And so keep in mind that these are average minimum temperatures. And so, an average means that some years it's going to be colder and some years it's going to be warmer. But those colder years are going to really limit what we can grow. So I try to choose varieties that are zone 3. You might be able to get away with more varieties that are, say, zone 4. But I would suspect if you planted some zone 5 plants in Cheyenne, that they might, depending on the weather, they might be able to live for 5 or 10 years before we get one of those really cold winters that, wipes them out. So when Catherine says, you think you're doing everything right and then something happens, oftentimes that's the something that happens. But other somethings that happen besides really cold weather events, we have extreme temperature drops in the fall, where we have a beautiful fall where we've had 50 and 60 degree weather, and then winter shows up one day and it drops from 50 or 60 degrees to 20 below within a 24-hour or 48-hour period of time. And those extreme temperature drops can also wreak havoc on not just fruit trees, but all of our trees and shrubs. And we're actually seeing a lot of that this year. Extended periods of time where the ground is frozen over the winter can mean a lot of drought stress injury to your trees. When the ground is frozen, those tree roots can't take up moisture from the soil. So one of the things we can do is, when we get a thaw, it's really helpful to go out and do some winter watering, especially on our evergreens and fruit trees. But in a winter like we just had this last year, we had snow on the ground from October till April. We didn't have a thaw and have a week of 40-degree temperatures where I could go out and water. And so I did actually lose a fair number of fruit trees on my orchard this year, just simply because we had an extreme temperature drop in October, and then I couldn't get water to them for about 6 months. And so those types of conditions will create major problems, especially for young trees. So I still have some trees that are leafing and that did leaf out and flowered this year, but I also lost some trees that have been able to survive the last 5 years in Laramie too. So anyway, winters can be really hard on your fruit trees. Besides cold hardiness, a couple other things you need to know about selecting fruit trees is that some fruit trees are going to require cross-pollination, and some fruit trees are self-pollinating. For those that require cross-pollination, you need to plant more than one variety. Unless you have, and keep in mind that like a crabapple tree in your yard or your neighbor's yard can pollinate your apple trees. And there are enough crab apples in town that maybe you could get away with just planting one variety of apple tree, and that crab apple tree, the half a block from your house, will pollinate your apple tree. But apples do require cross-pollination from another variety. So you can't just plant 2 Honeycrisp apples. They won't pollinate each other. You have to plant, for example, like a Honeycrisp and a Enterprise, or a Honeycrisp and a Pearl Red. So you have two different varieties that will cross-pollinate each other. Pears also require cross-pollination, and plum trees do as well. Most cherries and peach trees are self-pollinating, so you can just plant one. So let's just kind of jump right into some of the varieties of apples you might try growing, and then we'll get into more detail regarding how to grow them and some of the tips and tricks to success. With apples, you'll often notice if you go to the nurseries or shop online and look at apple varieties, and in the description, the hardiness. They'll talk about the fruit flavor, fruit size, but they'll also talk about early season, mid-season, and late season characteristics. And what this means is that there's early season varieties are going to bloom and produce earlier in the year than a mid-season or a late season variety. And so in terms of choosing compatible pollinators, you want to match early season varieties together. You can match early season and mid-season varieties together. You can match mid-season varieties with late season varieties, but early season varieties will not work well with late season varieties. There's going to be too much of a gap between when those fruit trees are blooming. And so the early season varieties might start blooming, depending on when things warm up. But they might start blooming in mid-May, and those late season apples might not bloom until early to mid-June. Okay, so, and by then those early season varieties are done blooming, and so we're not gonna get cross-pollination to happen from an early season to a late season variety. So that's another consideration to make sure that you're aware of. In terms of early season varieties, some really reliable producers are Lodi, Norland, and Yellow Transparent. The risk you run with the early season varieties is that, the earlier they bloom, the more chance they have to be in bloom during a cold night in Wyoming. We might have a 2 or 3 week warm spell where we get some 50, 60 degree weather. Things start to bud and flowers open, and then we get that, that one cold night that gets down to 20 degrees and a snowfall. Okay, so anything below 28 degrees is probably going to kill about 90% or more of the flowers on your tree and wipe out the crop. So the later season varieties have less of a chance because they'll bloom later, which means, more likely that we won't have a cold late freeze one night. But the drawback there is with those late season varieties, since they bloom later, they also ripen and you're harvesting them later in the year, which means there's more of a risk at the end of the growing season that we have that October snowstorm, maybe even a September snowstorm, that knocks the fruit off of the tree before it has a chance to fully ripen. So there's kind of that balance there of, well, if we lose the flowers, we're not going to have a fruit. But if it blooms too late and we get a fall freeze, the fruit doesn't have enough time to ripen. And so I kind of prefer the mid-season varieties because they bloom a little bit later and they ripen a little bit earlier. And so, there's no guarantees with any of those, but those mid-season varieties might give you, you might hit that sweet spot. But again, there's no guarantees with any of these. But some of the mid-season varieties that have survived for me on my orchard, and I'll also mention that I grew almost all of these apples in my orchard in Laramie. Although some of these varieties I added to the list from working with Steve Miller, who you may be aware of, started the Wyoming Apple Project. And he's a botanist with the University of Wyoming who has done a fair amount of research around the state, traveling around to old homesteads around Wyoming and identifying through some genetic work some of these heirloom varieties that were planted on old homesteads, 100 years ago, and are still alive and producing apples. So, in working with him and his list of apples that he's found on homesteads, and then some of the newer varieties that I've included in my study here in Laramie, that's really how I came up with this list. But some of the mid-season varieties, Cortland, Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp is one that you've probably seen in the grocery stores that a lot of people are familiar with. I will say, of all the trees I've planted in Laramie, Honeycrisp has the best or the highest survival rate. Jonathan, Liberty, McIntosh, and Wealthy, they're all mid-season varieties. And then your late season varieties, Freedom, Harold Red, Harrelson, Enterprise, and Wolf River. So you might not be familiar with all these varieties because, you're not going to find most of these in the grocery store. And unless you grow them, you're just, or know somebody who does grow them, you're not going to find them. So I'll just give you a little bit more information on these apples and what type of characteristics they have. So Lodi is a green apple, really tart. It's a really early apple. They tend to be fairly small green apples, but they ripen fairly early. They have good cold hardiness. If you like tart apples, like Granny Smith's, you might like Lodi, but for that reason, they're also a good cooking apple like Granny Smith's are. So Lodi's would be one. If you like cooking apples, you might consider growing. They're not my favorite apple to eat, although I admit I have a sweet tooth. So for eating apples, I do have a preference for the sweeter varieties. Norland, this is one that you can grow just about anywhere in Wyoming. It's an early variety and it's hardy to zone 2. So for anybody who wants to grow an apple tree in Wyoming, I would say Norland would be probably the best bet for anybody. It'll grow just about anywhere in the state. Yellow Transparent is a zone 3, so it's fairly cold hardy. So I've had, this one has survived for me here in Laramie. I would suspect you wouldn't have any problem growing it in Laramie County. It's another early season variety. This, apple scab has not been a huge issue for me in my orchard, but in areas where there are lots of apples growing, apple scab can be a major disease problem in your orchard. And so one of the benefits one of the nice things about Yellow Transparent is that it is resistant to apple scab. I like this one just for eating, but it's also a good cooking apple. Moving on to our mid-season varieties, Cortland might be one of my favorite apples that I'm growing on the orchard in Laramie. This one has survived for me. Even this year when I lost some trees, Cortland has survived. It's listed as a zone 4. It's one of those apples it's an heirloom variety. It's been around for a long time. Steve Miller has found this on old homesteads throughout Wyoming. And so for that reason, I would call it a reliable variety. And, to just, add to that, it has survived for me here in Laramie. So even at 7,200 feet, it's been able to survive. And as I said, it's a delicious apple. Again, like I said, I have a sweet tooth, but it is one of my favorite apples. Honeycrisp. This is one that people are familiar with and get excited about. Oh, I can grow a Honeycrisp in Wyoming. Yep. This one has been a very reliable apple for me here in Laramie. It has been, so this was an apple that was bred variety. It was bred in Minnesota, and it was bred for flavor and cold hardiness. And so, it was bred specifically to be an eating apple and for flavor that people enjoy. But I will say I have fire blight, and I'll talk more about fire blight later, but Honeycrisp is definitely susceptible to fire blight. And in fact, I've had fire blight in every single one of my Honeycrisp trees. Ooh. They've survived, but I also have some disease problems that I have to manage in my Honeycrisp trees. So that's, both good and bad. Good flavor, not disease resistant, and actually very susceptible to fire blight disease. Jonathan is one you've probably heard of. This is an older variety, another zone 4 apple that's pretty sweet, has good flavor, and is a reliable producer. Liberty. Now this is probably the one I'm most excited about. One, because it's a delicious apple. Just really, again, probably it ranks up there with Cortland as one of my favorites. It's a delicious, very delicious apple. But the thing that I like about it and makes me excited about it is that it's also resistant to apple scab, fire blight, and powdery mildew. And so those are, 3 of the main disease issues that you will find in an apple orchard. And we have an apple here that's cold hardy, and it's resistant to those 3 diseases, which means we don't have to spray, fungicides or pesticides to control those diseases. And for that reason, Liberty is also a very popular choice for organic apple growers. But anyway, Liberty is one I would highly recommend because of its flavor and its disease resistance. Macintosh is another older variety you've probably heard of. It's a tart, juicy apple. It's hardy to zone 4. Again, if you like the tart apples, it can be a good eating apple. It can be a good cooking apple as well, but it's a reliable producer, and it is a zone 4 apple. So that said, you don't see any notes here about disease resistance, and most of these heirloom varieties don't have disease resistance, so you can expect to find, especially powder or fire blight in your Macintosh trees and other heirlooms. Wealthy. This is the variety that Steve told me he found more than any others on the old homesteads around Wyoming, and he found them throughout the state, from north to south to east to west. This one, he said, was by far the most numerous, most popular variety that he found throughout Wyoming. It's listed as a zone 4. I've had it, I've grown it in Laramie, but like I said, it's found throughout Wyoming. It will get fire blight, like many of the heirloom varieties will, but it's still a reliable producer and fairly cold hardy. Moving on to some our late season varieties. Freedom is another one that's pretty exciting to me because it's also resistant to apple scab, fire blight, powdery mildew, and also cedar apple rust. But it's a zone 4, it's a late season zone 4 apple, which means your flowers are more likely to survive, but it may not have enough time to fully ripen if we have an early winter. Enterprise, same thing. It's another disease-resistant variety, resistant to scab, fire blight, mildew, and cedar apple rust, late season, zone 4, but a really delicious apple, but kind of the same notes that or same comments I just made. In terms of flowers will more likely survive, but the if we have an early winter, the apples may not have enough time to fully ripen late in the season. Harold Red, this is a late season as well, but it's a zone 3, a little more cold hardy. It's an heirloom variety that actually has some disease resistance. So this is one that is more of an exception than a rule. It's an heirloom variety that's resistant to fire blight. So you're not going to find that very often. But with Harold Red, you will. And there's another variety called Harold Sun that is also a very well-documented, successful apple tree for growing in Wyoming. The same breeder discovered both Harold Red and Harold Sun. But Harold Red is a little bit earlier than Harold Sun, which means it has a little better chance of ripening and developing than the Harold Sun varieties. And then Wolf River, I didn't grow this one in Laramie, but this is one that Steve has found, again, on homesteads throughout the state. It's a zone 3. It's resistant to apple scab, mildew, and cedar apple rust. Not resistant to fire blight, though, unfortunately. But the really cool thing about this apple is it is the biggest apple you will ever see. These apples can get up to 8 inches in diameter. So we're talking, almost dinner plate sized apples. But that said, that's part of the reason why it's a late season variety. It takes a while for a fruit that size to develop. So, on a good year, if you get an 8-inch apple, you take that to the county fair if you can part with it. Otherwise, just, take it to the Master Gardener meeting and brag and show off to all of your colleagues. But anyway, that's really the neat thing about Wolf River. It's just the size of the apple. They're not bad. They're not my favorite apple, but just the fact that you can grow an 8-inch fruit off of an apple tree is impressive, regardless of the flavor. So I think that's my last, so that's kind of just a quick glance at the varieties that you might consider growing here in Wyoming. Beyond variety selection, though,
Can I just put that down?
Yeah. We might also consider rootstock selection. So we can sometimes have some say in the rootstock that is attached to the tree, but usually we're limited just in terms of selecting a dwarf, semi-dwarf, or a seedling or standard sized tree. And those rootstocks really just tell us how big or how tall is this tree going to get. And so, if you really get into growing apples, you can mail order specific rootstock and then graft your, the variety that you choose onto that rootstock. But if you just go to the garden center or even most online retailers, you can basically choose dwarf, semi-dwarf, or seedling rootstock. And within those, there's actually a lot more options available, but you're kind of limited to what they have in stock or what they have on hand that is already attached to the variety that you're wanting to buy. If you do want to get more into selecting rootstock, specific rootstock varieties, you can look at rootstocks that will provide size control as well as disease resistance. Some rootstocks will affect yield and productivity, cold hardiness, and soil tolerance, particularly salt and pH tolerance.
Hey, Chris, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute for a question because I think we're at an appropriate spot for a question.
Great.
And one came through, it says, what do you do with fruit trees that died this winter? I have some that have shoots coming out from low on the trunk, but the outside branches are not leafing out. So it sounds like the main grafted tree died, but the rootstock is coming back. So what's your words of advice for that?
So good timing, because this picture kind of shows maybe what, and this is a very young tree, but so all apple trees are going to be grafted, and on a young tree you're going to be able to see that graft union. In this picture, if you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor, this is that graft union. Okay, so everything below this is the rootstock, and everything above this graft union is the variety of fruit tree that we are expecting to harvest. Okay, so that rootstock is not going to produce the same type of apple that we would harvest from the variety that's grafted above that graft union. So if you're seeing that everything at the top of the tree has died back and the only growth that you're seeing is coming up from the roots or from the base of the plant below that graft union, I can't tell you what variety that is. It's, you know, it's whatever that rootstock on that tree is. And so will it, you know, if you let it grow, would it produce apples eventually? Yes. I couldn't tell you what type of apples though. You just have to, you know, wait and see. But most likely it's not going to be an apple that's going to be very desirable. So typically I would say if the above ground portion has died back and you're just seeing growth from the base of the tree, it's probably time to dig it up and replant and make another selection. If you're seeing that individual branches have died back in the tree canopy, but maybe, you know, 75% of the tree looks okay, that might be more due to a disease issue like fire blight than, say, a cold hardiness issue that may have killed the above ground portion, but the underground portion, the rootstock that was a little more protected because it was under the snow or it was underground, was able to survive. So when we talk about, so when we see that, that's usually, or that's oftentimes more of an environmental issue that's caused the dieback, and oftentimes it's cold temperature injury. But sometimes fire blight can also be fatal, especially to younger trees.
So Chris, along that line of thought, another question's come through about the sprouts. You know, the main part of the tree has died back, but the sprouts are coming back, are just above the graft union. So the question is, how long would it take for it to bear fruit from those new shoots?
Sure. So probably about 3 to 5 years. If it's from above the graft union. So in this picture, like right here, you could see a bud or an old bud. Here's another one. You know, if those buds break and you see shoots forming there, but everything above that is dead, you could make a pruning cut right here above that bud or above that shoot, and you know, that would essentially be like almost like planting a new tree, except for the root system is well established, which maybe will give it a little bit more of an advantage or a head start. But typically it's going to be 3 to 5 years before we'll see those branches produce flowers and we'll see fruit production. Good questions. Just a little bit more on rootstock. So like I said, all of our trees are going to be grafted. The old rootstocks that you'll find are the M series. And so the M27s are going to be your dwarf. M9s are going to be dwarf. Those are going to be trees that get around 6 feet tall. Your semi-dwarf trees, they're going to be the common semi-dwarf rootstock are going to be M106, M111, and M25. And those are going to be, you know, somewhere between, say, 12 and 15 feet tall. And we can keep them pruned to 10 feet tall if we want to. But if we just let them go, they're going to get, you know, 12 to 15 feet tall. And those are, like I said, those are the older rootstock selections that we have. Some of the newer rootstock selections, though, that came out of New York, these are called Geneva rootstock, and you'll see them either called Geneva or just abbreviated as G, like G11, G41. Okay, and so they'll often use the M series as a comparison. So here you can see in terms of size control, there's a number of Geneva rootstocks that we can choose from. And so a seedling or a standard variety is one that will grow to full size. So that's one that if we let it grow is going to grow, say, maybe 30, 40, 50 feet tall. And so these Genevas are going to be also compared to those seedling varieties, so 30%, 35 to 40%, 40 to 50% of those seedlings. So as a comparison, those numbers will correlate to the size control that rootstock provides. But more importantly, in my mind, is that some of these Geneva rootstock selections can also provide disease resistance, particularly to fire blight. And that's what I would focus on. Again, if you are able to select your rootstock on the variety of tree that you are looking for. From my experience, your best chance of doing that is by mail ordering the rootstock and then grafting a specific variety onto that rootstock. Because again, when you order online or you go to the local garden center, they're probably just going to tell you it's semi-dwarf, dwarf, or standard. And you're not going to be able to, oftentimes you're not going to be able to get more detailed information from a retail nursery. So I say this, you know, with a grain of salt. It's nice to have these selections, but oftentimes you're limited to, you know, the stock on hand unless you do the grafting yourself. But as master gardeners, you now have that information. So let's talk a little bit more about those. Those dwarf trees, they're going to grow about 6 feet tall, and we can space a lot of trees, or, you know, we can grow a lot of trees in a small amount of space because you can plant them 5 feet apart and basically grow a wall of trees, and they're very productive. And look at these, the picture on the bottom here. These trees are loaded with fruit. And since they only grow 5 or 6 feet tall, they have very small trunks. And the weight of the fruit when they're, when these trees are mature, the weight of the fruit can actually pull the tree down and snap the trunk and kill the tree. And so dwarf trees do need to be staked or grown on a trellis that will support them. And the common thought, the common thinking with dwarf trees is that a dwarf root system is essentially a weak root system that lacks vigor. And that lack of vigor is what limits the height and the size of the tree. And so you put a tree with a weak root system in a harsh environment, in a junk soil that we have in many locations in Wyoming, that those dwarf trees are going to struggle. And I will say that that's been my experience in Laramie. In the first 5 years, I lost about 50% of my dwarf trees. And this last winter, so I started off with 18 dwarf trees, and I'm down to 1 now. So after 5 years, and that was 6 different varieties of trees, 18 total trees, and I have 1 left. So I had, up until last year, I had a 50% survival rate. So I had 9 of the 18 original dwarf trees that had lived for 4 years, and then this last winter got almost all of the rest, all but 1 of the rest of those trees. So unfortunately, from my experience, dwarf trees do struggle here in Wyoming, regardless of the variety. Semi-dwarf rootstock is typically what I recommend, whether it's a home orchard, a backyard or apple tree or 2, or someone interested in commercial production. They are a little more vigorous. They're heavier producers and more reliable producers. They grow a little bit bigger, so again, 12 to 15 feet, and we plant them about 12 to 15 feet apart in the rows and try to maintain trees that are 10 to 12 feet tall. The nice thing about that is that we can do most of the harvesting with our feet on the ground. We don't have to get up on a ladder to get the apples at the top of the tree, or at least 90% of them. And if we keep them pruned, a little bit lower, we can manage these trees so that we can keep our feet on the ground. So in this picture, that's my wife standing in front of a semi-dwarf apple tree. So, size-wise, you can see how tall those trees are, and the access or ease of picking these apples is, pretty easy. So for those reasons, I think semi-dwarf trees are probably ideal for most of us who want to grow apple trees. We don't have to stake them. We just have to give them enough room, and then we have to do some pruning. The standard size trees are the seedling trees. Also from my experience, very limited availability. Semi-dwarf and dwarf trees are readily available, but I had a hard time finding the standard size trees. But I usually don't recommend them unless you really want an apple tree that's really more of a landscape or an ornamental tree that also produces apples. Because eventually those trees are going to get 20, 30, 40 feet tall, and all of the apples are going to be up at the top. And the squirrels will get to them, but you're going to have a real hard time harvesting from a full-sized tree. And so besides the lack of availability, I personally don't like to grow them for apple production because when they're mature, it's really hard to get to the apples until they fall to the ground. And then they're fine, I guess, for applesauce. But for a landscape tree, they have beautiful flowers in the spring, and certainly will attract wildlife, such as birds and squirrels. Okay, so what's next? Fire blight resistant apple varieties. I just want to highlight again, Enterprise, Freedom, Harold Red, and Harold Sun are all, actually Liberty. I somehow missed Liberty on this list, but I should add that, or you should add that to your memory, that these are all going to be great choices because fire blight is such a common issue in fruit trees that if you don't have resistant varieties, it's going to show up in your orchard. It shows up as discolored wood, and then canker develops, bark starts to flake off. It enters the tree through the blooms, but it can also enter through like the graft union here or other wounds on the tree. If it gets into the trunk of a 1 or 2 year old tree, it can be fatal. In a mature tree, it tends to stay in the branches of the tree and not infect the tree trunk. So once the trees are established, you can have pretty good results controlling fire blight through pruning. But choosing resistant varieties means that you don't have to deal with a major disease problem, and a disease problem that can certainly kill your trees. So here are my trees that I mail ordered. They came bare root. They ship them in April because, in other parts of the world, you can start planting that time of the year. But in Laramie, that means that you have to hold them and keep them alive and watered until you can plant them in May or June. And so I stuck them in planters in a high tunnel and packed the bare root balls in potting soil until I had a chance to get them in the ground. So there's your tip for holding them over if you do mail order bare root trees. And here you go. Here's my seedling apple trees, part of the orchard here that I planted. Initially, I didn't stake my trees, but then after about a week after I planted them, we had our lovely Laramie wind, and I came out to the orchard one day and all of the apples were leaning at the same angle in the same direction. And so, yes, the wind did mean that I probably should stake them. So I ended up staking them. If you do stake your trees, just leave the stakes for 1 year if needed to help the trees stand upright. Remove the stakes at the end of the growing season.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah.
I do have a question here about apple variety, and it's on the Zestar apple.
Okay.
Is that an apple that you would consider?
So I actually planted Zestar in my variety study. It didn't make my list because all of my Zestar trees died. I will say that Zestar, so I only planted 3 trees. 2 of the Zestars died the first winter, and I had 1 Zestar that hung on until last year. So it actually survived a little bit longer, but not long enough to actually give me fruit. But that is here in Laramie. If my memory serves correctly, Zestar is a zone 4 apple tree. And so you might have better luck with it in Cheyenne than I did here in Laramie. So yes, it is one I would consider. And like I said, I did try it, but it didn't, I lost all 3 of the Zestar trees that I planted. The other thing I wanted to point out in this picture is you can see the drip irrigation system that I set up here. Well, first of all, this field, if you've ever been out to the student farm here in Laramie, you know that thistle grows all over the place, and that's putting it gently. This was a thistle field prior to me planting my apples. And so we controlled the thistles, which is why the ground is completely bare in this picture. It's not so bare anymore, but anyway, we installed a drip system to water the trees, but we didn't want to do overhead irrigation initially because we knew if we watered that whole field that the thistle and other weeds would just come back and I'd have a thistle field again. And we wanted to plant kind of a pollinator friendly mix in between the trees. So anyway, that came later, but the drip system actually worked really well. I did 2 rings of drip line around each tree, and this can work really well for young trees. As the trees mature, we'll have to an overhead system. But I started with 2 rings, and then, so this was my orchard last year. And you can see the difference in size in these trees. So this was year 1. There's hardly any lateral branches on these trees. And this is year 4, where I actually have a decent sized trees with lateral branching. And I got my first, these are the Liberty apples in these pictures. And you can see I actually got my first apples off of my Liberty trees last year. And as these trees grew, I actually added a 3rd ring to my drip system to accommodate the root zone that has expanded as that tree has grown as well. With apple trees, we prune to what's called a central leader training system. So that means we want to have a tree trunk that goes from the bottom to the top of the tree. And then we want to have these whorls or layers of branches. We want to have about 3 to 5 branches in each layer, and then about 2 to 3 feet in between a layer, and then have our 2nd layer of branches, and then maybe a 3rd layer of branches at the top of the tree, and that's where we're going to maintain the height of that tree, meaning that it's going to be 10 to 12 feet tall, and we're going to be able to pick most of the apples with our feet on the ground. That's a very quick and simplified pruning instruction, but essentially that's what you want, a nice uniform tree with about 3 different layers of branches separated by about 2 to 3 feet in between those layers. And the reason we do that is because sunlight really helps with the ripening of fruit. And if we don't do the pruning, we get a really dense tree that doesn't allow sunlight into the canopy. And also we get a lot of, eventually we get a lot of flowers, which means a lot of fruit production, and the trees will tend to overproduce. So the pruning actually also does some thinning on the tree, which reduces the number of apples on the tree. But what that also does is increase the size and the sugar content of the apples that are on the tree. And so we get fewer apples, but they're bigger, sweeter, and much higher quality fruit than if we didn't do any pruning on them. We also want to remove any of those suckers or shoots that grow up around the base of the tree, because again, those are coming up from the rootstock and are not the variety of apple that we're trying to grow, okay? We also might do some hand thinning, and there's different approaches on this, but basically growers tend to thin. So a flower cluster might have 7 flowers, but most growers will thin those clusters to either pairs or triplets. And in this picture, you see that those have been thinned to 3 apples. And what you want to do is select the 3 biggest apples out of the cluster and remove any apples that have been, you know, hailed on, that have hail damage, a bird pecked on them, or a worm found its way into. You know, those are the ones that you'll thin out and leave the biggest and most vigorous and most healthy looking fruit, and thin it down to 2 or 3 apples in each cluster. And do that in addition to the pruning that we do. And you'll have, the result will be, again, bigger apples with higher sugar content. Now that said, this is a wealthy apple in my backyard that finally produced fruit. I had like 2 apples on the tree the first year it fruited. And then I went out one day and I looked and discovered that, oh, guess what? Codling moth. So even if we do get fruit production, we have to deal with other pests besides the diseases we've mentioned, but codling moth will lay its eggs and the larva will tunnel into those apples and yeah, make you want to kill every moth that you see. So there's pheromone traps and there's insecticides that you can use that are listed here, neem oil, pyrethrins, but I would suggest spinosad, which is an organic that you apply every 2 or 3 weeks, you apply it every 2 weeks, and you start spraying it right after 2 to 3 weeks after the trees bloom. But all you have to do is just like 1 squirt into the tree. You don't have to cover the whole tree. You don't have to spray every apple. Just 1 squirt into the tree will protect the tree. And so for that reason, spinosad is one that's very popular with the growers. You can also, if you don't want to use insecticides, you can actually put paper bags around the fruit as they're developing to create a physical barrier that the moth can't get through to lay its eggs on your apples. It's a pretty labor intensive, but if you only have 1 or 2 trees, you can certainly do it, okay? Here's a picture of fire blight later in the season. Typically what you see, besides the discoloration in the wood that I showed you earlier, is that the infected branches, the leaves turn brown and hang on the tree. The brown leaves don't fall off. And so we typically just use pruning to remove those infected branches. Some people might consider like a copper-based spray to control fire blight, but from my experience, pesticides have very limited effectiveness on fire blight, and pruning will give you just as good or better results without the use of pesticides. Okay, and I know we're maybe we've already run out of time, so I just want to quickly mention some pears and just quickly mention some of these other fruit trees. Giant Asian pears, collet, and then kefir, golden spice, luscious, Parker, and Summercrisp are some pear varieties to consider. Again, the handout is available in the chat box if you don't have time to write those down. But for peaches, Contender is the variety to try. For cherries, these are all sour cherries or bush cherries. Balaton, Compass, Red Diamond, Black Tartan. Montmorency is the one I would say that I see more than any others. North Star, and then a bush cherry is Nanking. And then there's a new, I haven't grown this one myself, but it's a new sweet cherry variety that's a zone 4. That if you really want to try a sweet cherry in Wyoming, it's called Kristen sweet cherry. That would be the one sweet cherry I would try. Unfortunately, we can't grow Rainiers and Bings in Wyoming. If you want to grow plums, plums are great fruit trees for the backyard. You really don't have to do any pruning or worry about pest management. They're pretty problem-free and easy to grow. The one I would recommend is called, it's either called Toka or Bubblegum, and it's hardy to -50. And it's a very reliable, heavy producer. Excuse me, one of my coworkers has one in her backyard, and she brings me a bucket full of plums to work every year. So, excuse me, I always look forward to that. We prune them a little bit different. So you can see we have an open center rather than a central leader on our stone fruits, our cherries, peaches, and plums. And And then maybe I'll just briefly, just other fruit trees to consider: choke cherry, serviceberry, crabapple, hawthorn, elderberry, currant, honeyberry, goji berry. So those were my other fruit trees. So sorry I rushed through that last part just for the sake of time, but I also wanted to see if there was any more questions or discussion before I wrap things up this evening.
So Chris, I do have a question here about how to treat for apple scab.
So apple scab, that is a good question. So I'm real quick. I'm going to check my handy resource. Oh, 1 second. Tab. Actually, I'll share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at too. Okay, this is it's, if you can see the website, PNW Handbooks. It's a Pacific Northwest Handbooks. I spent about 12 years living in the Pacific Northwest, so this is just a resource I'm familiar with. There's a lot of things in here that don't apply to us in Wyoming, but there's a lot of things in here that do. So for apple scab, here you go. Here's some pictures of the lesions will infect the leaves, but we'll also see lesions on the fruit as well. So what do we say? Cultural controls, disease-resistant varieties. Okay, I mentioned some of those. Existing plantings. Avoid wetting the leaves when irrigating. So trying to keep the overhead irrigation off of the leaves, right? That can help reduce the disease pressure. Rake the leaves in the fall because the infection will overwinter on those leaves. And then for chemical control options, when I use this resource, I look for, right here, you see this H, that means homeowner use. And then if you see an O, which I'm not seeing here, that's going to be an organic product. So for homeowner use, right here, Bayer, advanced disease control, Bonide, Funginil, multi-purpose fungicide. If it doesn't have an H next to it, it's going to be a restricted use pesticide. Let me scroll down and see if I see any others that I might recommend. Here we go. Infused systemic disease control is another homeowner. Fertilome makes a product, systemic fungicide as well. Spectracide, Immunox is another fungicide spray for homeowner use. Scrolling, so you can see there's a wide selection of chemical control options for for apple scab, and a handful for homeowner use.
And so one of the important things you need to, if you're going to use a chemical to control scab, so this is my Jeff Edwards side coming out on me, and the label is the law, and you need to read the label and make sure that it is labeled for apples, and when you can spray it, and how soon you can actually eat those apples after you've sprayed them. So
yeah,
read that label.
Yeah, and they'll note here too, like 24-hour re-entry, but also look at the label to see what's the pre-harvest interval. So is it, is it 2 weeks or is it 2 days? That makes a big difference, how soon can you harvest those apples and safely after you've sprayed. And also, like Catherine mentioned, when can you spray and not harm the tree and cause more harm than good.
Okay, Chris, I do have another question for you, and it's about pruning. And I know when I teach pruning, I talk about being ruthless, and that's hard for a lot of people. But the question is there a magic formula for pruning? My trees are quite tall and not bushy like the pictures.
So if you want to reduce the height of the tree, what you can do is follow that trunk down to a lateral branch that's, maybe 10 feet, 12 feet, wherever that branch is, in sort of a manageable range. You can reduce the height of the tree. You've got to work with what you've got to. So those trees that in the pictures that I showed you, those were trees that were pruned and trained from the day they were planted and were pruned every year. If pruned, you got to work with what you've got. You're probably not going to have that, perfect picture of whorled branches, these layers that have 3 to 5 branches and 2 to 3 feet separate those layers of branches. So you can do some thinning to open up and create some space in between those branches. But you're gonna do some selective pruning, selective thinning, and it may be done over the course of a year or 2 or 3, depending on how big the tree is, to bring it down to a more manageable size and really improve the size and form of the tree. If you want to send me some pictures of your tree, I could do some like Photoshop drawing or something on that picture and send it back to you and kind of indicate where I would do some pruning cuts and give you some suggestions on how you might do that. So if you would like to, I'll type my email address into the chat box, and if you want to try that, I'd be glad to take a look. Oop, sorry, I had a typo. That's not my right email address. That second one is, I forgot the U. It's chilgert@uwyo.edu.
Okay, is there any other questions? If you've got a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask. And this is a great opportunity if you have any fruit tree related questions. It doesn't have to be apples. It can be peaches, apricots, pears, nectarines. Go ahead and, if you've got a question, go ahead and ask. So Chris, while people are trying to think of questions for you, I do run into people that try to grow nectarines here and not very successfully. I see peach trees now and then, and apricots are tough, but I see them once in a while. Any thoughts about those?
So of those, I would say apricots you'd have the best luck with. I actually have seen apricots produce in Wyoming. I would say go into it with the expectation that you're not going to get fruit off of those trees every year. It's just not realistic to expect them to produce fruit every year. We're gonna have a cold snap when they're blooming that's going to wipe out the flowers. And so, but if you do harvest a fruit off of them once every 5 years, you're doing a good job. I've seen a lot of apricot tree or plants that have survived. They're 20 years old maybe, but they've only produced fruit once or twice in those 20 years. Same with peach trees. I don't know that I've seen a nectarine tree in Wyoming. I I would probably say that a nectarine is probably going to be an annual in Wyoming. They're less cold hardy than peaches, unfortunately. So give them a very protected location, plant them near the house, you know, in a location that maybe a microclimate that has a little protection. And if you're out in a more exposed location out on the prairie, you know, I think you're really going to struggle to try to grow peaches, nectarines, and apricots. But hey, if you want to give it a try, you know, give it a try. I would just go into it with some realistic expectations. And if you do get some fruit off of those trees, more power to you. And I want to, don't share them with me because you deserve to eat all of the, but I do want to see the pictures.
So any other questions out there? You're welcome to ask, or you can type it into chat and I'll ask Chris. But again, this has been recorded. This will be available on the Laramie County Extension's website, and it'll also be available on the Laramie County Master Gardener's website. So 2 places to go find it, and then if you need those addresses, because I don't have them off the top of my head, other than my Master Gardeners. That's the Laramie County Master Gardener website, easy. I remember it because it's easy. And if you're looking for the Laramie County Extension website, that's easy to just pull up online, do a Google search.
So
This is Dia.
And I also just pasted the link again into the chat box to a Dropbox folder where you can access the fruit trees presentation from tonight, as well as the strawberries and raspberries presentation that I'll give on July 8th.
Okay, so Chris, here's one for you. How do you deter animals like squirrels from taking plums?
Oh boy.
BB gun comes to mind. A 10-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, there are various options that range from lethal to deterrence. Bird netting over the entire tree can work. You got to get it on there early because the squirrels will even go after the fruit before it's ripe. But I've used bird netting on smaller trees and basically just draped it over the whole tree and tied it off onto the trunk so that they couldn't get into the tree. I've had some success with that. I've also had very ambitious squirrels that ripped the bird netting right off and ripped every apple off of my trees. And so then you start to consider other lethal options. But yeah, pets, somebody commented cats. Cats and dogs, if you have a small backyard with a fruit tree, cats and dogs can do a good job of keeping squirrels and rabbits and critters like that out of your garden and out of your orchard. Bird netting. People will also use things like scarecrows, owls, like owl statues, balloons that look like big eyeballs, real sparkly, glittery types of ribbons tied up in the tree that blow in the wind. But those tend to be kind of temporary scare tactics, and that they work short term, but eventually the birds and the squirrels figure out that, oh, that's not actually an owl. That's that's just a statue. that hasn't moved for the last 5 weeks. So again, short term, those types of things can work, but long term, the animals seem to figure it out. Somebody said CDs, yeah. CDs, the same thing as the glittery type of ribbons you might tie in the tree. You know, something like that that's going to blow in the wind, reflect some light. You know, those again can have some limited effectiveness on squirrels and other critters.
This is Di. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, yeah.
I have a question. We lived in north of here in Buffalo, Wyoming, and we raised a plum cherry cross very successfully. Have you tried any cross hybrid trees of that nature?
I have not. Do you know what the variety is or what it's called?
I just know it was a plum cherry cross.
So plums and cherries are both prunus species or genus. But I personally have not, but now I'm intrigued.
Awesome.
So I'm going to have to look into that.
I asked the nursery out of Sheridan if they would order a fluot for me, which is the plum apricot, and they declined. They just didn't feel it would do well in that zone. But you know, Buffalo has a little bit of it's actually a little fruit orchard town.
Sure. So you might be able to find a pluot that's maybe a zone 4 or 5. But if you might try mail order. Burpees, Stark Brothers, McKay Nursery, St. Lawrence Nursery is another good online nursery that has cold hardy plants. So you might check those online retailers and see what options are available through them.
Good deal. Thank you.
Great. You're welcome. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I think I've made you stick around for an additional 20 minutes past our ending time, but I appreciate the discussion and the conversation. I'm happy to stick around, but also I want to respect your time too and not drag this on all night. And I will be back on July 8th to talk about the fruit or berry crops, raspberries and strawberries. And so if you have any other questions between now and then, I'll be happy to cover that then as well. And my email is in the chat box, and feel free to contact me for any other fruit tree questions as well.
Well, everyone, thanks for coming and thanks for attending tonight. And Chris, thanks for a great program. And we will see you in a couple weeks. So good night, everybody.
Sounds good. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.